cancel culture is real. It is real. It impacts people, organizations. And at the end of the day, it impacts dollars. Goodwill can create and generate revenue. I think organizations are not really understanding influence cancel culture can have on their bottom line. And a little goodwill, whatever that costs you, truly will create dividends. It really will.
Welcome to Problem Performers, a podcast about professionals who challenge the status quo at work. I'm Rebecca Weaver, and yes, I too have been labeled a problem performer at least once or twice in my career. But looking back, I now wear it as a badge of honor. In fact, all the most interesting people I know have earned this label at some point. In reality, these are the people who challenge their workplaces to be better and do better. I think we should all aspire to be problem performers in our work lives, because the only way to make real change is by shaking things up. So let's get started. Hi, everyone. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about an aspect of HR that I consider to be one of the worst parts of the job. And it's one part that I unfortunately have a lot of experience with. Today, we're talking about layoffs, and specifically how leaders can better handle layoffs. And we're asking this question: is it possible to conduct layoffs in an ethical way that treats employees with dignity and respect? Spoiler alert, the answer is absolutely yes. And since I myself have had the painful job of conducting layoffs many times in my career, I wanted to use today's episode to give you an insider perspective on what leaders often get wrong and what needs to change. My guest today is Brian Anderson, a 20-year HR veteran who spent his career managing HR for big corporate systems in healthcare, retail, private equity, and telecommunications. He has both a law degree and an MBA, which gives him a really deep understanding of how companies function in the greater context of the economy. He is also an HRUprise Coach and has a great understanding of the human side of the business. He specializes in people strategies that drive employee engagement and company revenue. And like me, he is an experienced administrator of the layoff process. So Brian, welcome to Problem Performers.
Rebecca, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
I am too. So today, we're going to use as the starting point something that was in the headlines recently. So as a starting point for our conversation, let me tell you just a little bit about what happened recently. And I know, Brian, you're really familiar with this. But what got us talking is the announcement that Better.com, a mortgage and finance company, had I think it's probably fair to call it a debacle with their layoffs. The CEO of Better.com, Vishal Garg, laid off 900 employees in a Zoom call. So let me just play a clip from this meeting that went viral.
This isn't news that you're going to want to hear. This is the second time in my career I'm doing this, and I do not want to do this. The last time I did it, I cried. This time I hope to be stronger. If you're on this call, you are part of the unlucky group that is being laid off. Your employment here is terminated effective immediately.
So, Brian, what was your initial reaction when you saw this story and read the details?
I was actually completely flabbergasted, right? I understand that technology has changed because of the pandemic. A lot of us are working virtually, right?
Yep.
But that this is probably not the best use of the tool, right?
Right.
The tool was not designed for this purpose. So I was completely flabbergasted because it is a complete, just horrible way for a CEO to deliver such a very, very traumatic message.
Yeah.
So I was taken aback. I actually almost thought it was a joke. I thought this was something that, nobody actually does this.
Right.
But then when I really dug into it, he's actually done this.
So there were a few things surrounding this story, or that came out kind of right around the same time as it sort of, the story started to pick up steam, that I thought were super interesting. And the first was that apparently this company had a huge influx of investment capital right before they made this decision. And literally like the day before, these 900 people were laid off. So let's dive into that for a moment. I mean, one of the things that when I'm coaching companies, or if I'm a part of a company that is considering layoffs, there is the whole process that leads into making that decision, right? Like, are layoffs even necessary in the first place? When you're working with companies, what are some of the decision factors that go into whether you even need to do a layoff or not?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned this because, I've read several articles on this, and I guess what was happening at the time was that Better.com was going public, and that's why they had received a lot of funding at that time. So there's, and it's interesting because, and this is a great question that you pose in terms of what do you, as a coach, HR, leader, how do you strategically advise your leaders or a company? Because there is one perspective. So again, I need to make sure that I'm grounding us in strategy as well. So I can understand how, as if I'm looking at it from the lens of a leader and I'm thinking, okay, I'm now having shareholders invest, I'm having people invest, I can almost understand the concept of I need to operate leaner,
Yeah.
right? I need to operate in a more leaner fashion. And so I do understand. I don't want to, gloss over the fact that there is some strategy perhaps behind it. I've worked in new ventures, and so I get it. I understand some of that need to change capacity. So that being said, though, I think one of the things that I truly, when I've, kind of advised leaders around this, is one, really take into account the strategy in terms of how you're going to think through becoming more lean and thinking through long term. Like, how does this impact your long term vision? Because the worst thing to happen is this: you lean down, and then 2 weeks later, you're like, oh my goodness, I needed 200 of those people, right? Because I didn't sit down and build a strategy out that said, I actually need that production arm, I need that operations arm, I need that sales arm, right? So clearly have a strategy. And I don't know if they did or didn't. I don't know if Better.com and said, hey, here's what we need to do. Here's the areas that we need to take a better look at. But I think the first thing that I would do when I'm strategically advising a company is to say, okay, think long term, right? Think long term strategy, because I think that's most important. Because yes, I get it. You might have to go leaner, but really think long term, really plan it out. Because I think that's then how you back into the conversations that he probably should have had better.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I have always coached business leaders is that, from my perspective, layoffs should always be the absolute last resort. I think what you're describing is the environment that is out there, which is profit at all costs. How can we maximize shareholder value, right? Which typically means running the business as lean as possible, which means these are all euphemisms that we use to describe. This means that we need to terminate all of these people, lay off all of these people, right? Or cut all of these jobs. And I've been thinking a lot about how we do that, how we use euphemisms to make it easier, I think, emotionally, to make decisions about having to cut jobs. And so that's one of the things that I think is so critically important for leaders, especially as we think about heading into the future, a more humane way of working, is that, again, layoffs may be a necessity for a company. You may get to the point where you just cannot continue at the current run rate that you have. But layoff should be the absolute last resort. And have we tried all of these other things before we get there? At the same time,
Exactly.
as an HR professional, as HR professionals, we know that uh, that your labor costs are typically the highest cost within the organization. And so it is, if you're looking at it again, purely from a financial perspective, that's of course where you would cut first if you have to trim your budget.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So how
Definitely.
do you balance that, as you're coaching business leaders or, have done this in the past? How do you balance all of those things? How do you think about it?
Rebecca, this is a wonderful conversation, because one of the things that I think is missing, because there's a couple of different dynamics. One, and I think we'll touch on it a little later, one is the current environment in which we live in today, which is very different given everything the world, not just organizations, so the world has gone through, kind of all of us being impacted by the pandemic. So I think that's one piece that we can touch that a little later. But I think the biggest thing that I find organizations who don't necessarily do this well, there's not real strategy. And I don't mean, and what I mean by that is sitting down and mapping out 4, 5 years, 2 years, like looking ahead to say, here's where we're going, right? Because you would imagine there's no way, and maybe it did occur, but I don't necessarily believe that this happened in a one-day vacuum where they were like, oh, we're going to give you however many millions of dollars to go. Like, there was a process. There's a lot of planning that goes into saying, hey, we're going to go public, or we're going to go, like, there's a real process that's involved. Start then, right? Start thinking through what you need to do. So for instance, part of it should be, if we back this plan out, and let's say we're going to do this 3 years out, well, don't rehire. As people actually leave, just don't backfill the position.
Yep.
Right. So
absolutely.
That's a one way. I mean, it's not going to get a whole lot, right? You might not, depending on what your attrition is, but that is one way. The other way is when you are actually going through a process of, again, how many people are going to retire, right? Do you think through long term? Well, here's the number of people who might be at the, that stage of retirement. Let me plan that out so that I can also think through that. Yep. There's so many other things that could be done, but you have to start early, right? You have to start with a strategy and kind of think through long term, which I don't think, there are companies that do not have that level of expertise to strategically think long term.
Yep, absolutely. So I think about some of the things that I have considered in some of my roles as we've been considering layoffs. It's, have we looked at all of the contractors, independent contractors, as the mix, and looking at those roles first? How about any seasonal roles, people in seasonal positions, any part-time, right? And so we work through all of those things first, work through how much of an impact will that have. And then, my goal has always been to do everything we can to protect the full-time roles, right? Full-time W-2 employees. And the assumption with that is that we have also done a good job of communicating the temporary status for any of those other roles that I just described, right? So that is the key. And sometimes it's a big assumption. But the goal is always to protect the full-time hours, right, of our employees. And again, so let's go through all of these other things. Have we cut our expenses? Have we looked at how many people, as you said, might be close to retirement, and offer them an early retirement? Have we looked at all of these things? So the other thing that I think is really important, that has not been there for some of the companies that I have worked with in that strategy that you're describing, Brian, is also planning for offering generous severance. So in the event that you have to get to layoffs, calculate in a generous severance for that as well. as I have certainly been in the position of having to not only communicate to someone that they're being laid off through no fault of their own, but I have also had to communicate to people, and also we have no severance to offer you.
Agreed. I mean, that's part of the strategy, right? That is very, very critical. It's there are several. I mean, again, there are several, I think, different aspects. When someone goes through a layoff, there's a lot of different emotion, right? And I think there's some other pieces that go into effect. When someone's laid off, I think there's obviously that initial emotion, shock, anger, fear, whatever emotion that person gets to. But then there's this realistic, real life, how am I going to pay my bills? Like, how am I going to feed myself? Right. So I think there's that initial piece, and then there's this right? If you can, the emotion's going to happen, right? As an organization, what I always tell people, yes, the emotion is going to happen,
of course,
because I am being removed from a relationship that I not necessarily wanted to be removed from, right? That's what's occurring. So I'm going to have some level of emotion.
Yep.
But then the next thing that's going to happen is I'm then going to get to a more realistic, I've got to handle real life stuff. Like, I have to pay bills. So I do think it's always important for when I'm coaching and talking to leaders around this function or this act that has to happen in terms of layoffs, understand those two separately. And that if you can provide some level of a severance, it does help impact the first emotion as well, right? And so I think it's very important. And again, not everyone has the budget to do so, et cetera. But again, it's all about starting early, strategize early, to think through how you're going to be able to offer a severance so that you can help impact that emotion that's going to be hit, that's going to be immediately seen by employees.
So, at HRUprise, we talk about blowing up a lot of the things that, have been considered good company policy or good company practice. And one of the things I would love to blow up is the practice of offering, like, for example, 1 week per year of service for people in severance. So yes, that's better than zero. So I will give you that, but it's an absolutely horrific practice for us to have. So let's think about it. The idea with it is that you give more severance to people who have been there longer. Okay, fair enough. And I would absolutely support that. What I would suggest needs to go in its place is a minimum amount of at least a month of severance for anybody, regardless of their time in role. And then on top of that, give some additional, amount, especially for your people who have been there for a long time. So that's what I propose in its place. But this idea of only 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever it is, right, per year of service, it means for the people who have very recently left another job, most likely, right, to come work for you, and now they're losing their job, and you're giving them, what's 1 week for most people in role, right? What's that going to cover? Maybe your electric bill, maybe.
Right. You know what, though, Rebecca, as we're talking, this actually brings up something that I think we might also want to touch on, is severance actually represents some level of, and I'm going to put it this way, let's say monetary value. I think what organizations should look at is monetary value means very different things to me. So for instance, if I'm laid off, in my severance package, not only should it be hard cash, but let's talk about perhaps extend my EAP offerings so that I have the ability to still perhaps get counseling, some level of like something for my kind of mental health. And I think especially, again, the changes that have happened in the past 2 years, organizations need to look at that very differently. How, like, my mental health, help me there. Okay. And then the other thing is, let's take a look at also not only offering me a level of EAP from that perspective, but also outplacement services, right?
Mm-hmm.
Help me find something else, right? Give me 3 months of outplacement services so I can meet with someone to talk about resumes. But I think that too is part of what I think organizations need to continuously think of. Those who do it well, they do that, right? They think of
Absolutely.
splitting those out. And so I'm not saying no one does that, but I think that's also something if other organizations are listening to this podcast and are thinking, wow, what can we take away? That would be one. EAP and also having outplacement makes a lot of sense.
That's right. And so for people who aren't familiar, the EAP is the Employee Assistance Program, which typically, in my experience, has been tied to medical benefits, right, or frequently is packaged together. It's one of those resources that I still would describe as kind of the unsung hero of the benefits world. It's one of those things that whenever, from the most part, anybody that I've talked to who has been able to utilize that service has found tremendous benefit. But it's just really, really underutilized. And so in most cases, if your company offers, now I'm talking to employees for a moment, if your company offers medical benefits, you most likely also have access to an employee assistance program. And so all you have to do is ask for that contact. And so they have tons of resources. They will typically give you a certain number of appointments with a mental health therapist. They can also help you with some financial planning. I mean, it's just a really wide variety of services, but I couldn't agree more that in this environment, more than ever, people need access to those kinds of resources. So those are some of the things that you need to consider as you're looking at how do we support. I mean, ultimately, the question is, how do we support employees who we have had to lay off, right? One of the things that I ask for business leaders to think about is your employees as an alumni network, right? And how would you approach it for an alumni network? Meaning you still want to have a relationship and it may be different than, they're no longer employed. But if you approach it with a mindset of an alumni network, it's much more about how can we care and support for these employees who may no longer be employees here, but that we're still doing the right thing.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I'm actually going to use that when I speak of it, because I really do like that. As we're talking, one of the things that also hit me in terms of an interesting offering in severance that I've not seen it at all in my many years of doing this, would be extended childcare services.
Yes.
Right. So if there's anything that as an employer I'm providing, so if I have an on-site daycare, if I'm paying for, I'm contributing in some way to, imagine how impactful that is to your little one who mom or dad gets laid off or both. And the little friends you had in, your daycare, you're now having to be pulled out of daycare because, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's those kind of things that when you start thinking of, wow, how can we do this in a more humane and just human way? Those are the kind of things that I think as organizations, they really need to look at. So I think it's really, really important.
I love that idea. I think that's incredibly, incredibly important. You think about it, a parent has lost their job. You're right. Their number one concern is going to be financial. Very close behind that is going to be, what about childcare? What am I going to do? And by the way, if I now have to look for a new job,
exactly.
Also having to worry about childcare would be just an additional stress, no question. So I love that suggestion. I think the other thing that in my experience, for someone who's been laid off, there's the initial kind of emotion and shock, and then the worry about paying for bills. And then also right behind that is medical benefits. Mm-hmm. What happens to my medical benefits? Because we're in a country where we still tie medical benefits to employment, which is probably a whole other podcast episode.
Yes.
It's the reality, right? And so for more than ever, make sure that you are offering additional COBRA, right? And again, for those who aren't familiar with COBRA, that is essentially the law that allows you to continue your medical benefits in the exact same plan. It typically ends up being much more expensive for the employee, but it is very common, and I think, again, should be a regular practice for employers, if they're offering severance, to also offer additional months of, like, we'll continue to cover your COBRA or cover your medical benefits for months. And that can even extend beyond the total amount of severance.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it's interesting, though. And when you mention it, it is still somewhat expensive for the employee. I'm not wanting to give away everything, right? I'm not saying, hey, organizations do everything, give everything away. But take a look at the cost of completely covering COBRA. Because here's the interesting thing that has happened. Again, we do not live in 2018 anymore. Cancel culture is real. It is real. It impacts people, organizations. And at the end of the day, it impacts dollars. Goodwill can create and generate revenue. I think organizations are not really understanding influence cancel culture can have on their bottom line. And a little goodwill, whatever that costs you, truly will create dividends. It really will, because that's where people are getting their information. People are not watching the news. They're looking at Instagram. They're looking at Facebook. They're looking at TikTok. And when they see that hit, it goes viral. Like this went viral.
It took very little time, right? Yeah, absolutely. Plus, I thought was so interesting. I mean, it was, somebody videotaping the Zoom call is what, again, was like shared all over the world in very little time.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So, if you have to get to that point, I think you're absolutely right. It's do everything you can for the employee. Again, this is through no fault of their own. So if you have to make that call, then do everything you can.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, one of the things that you mentioned earlier that I think is really important distinction for people is to think about the difference between termination and layoff. Can you talk about that?
So, it's, and I appreciate that. So when I think of a termination, so first of all, here's the one thing. I think people will automatically look at termination as being basically the overall umbrella, which includes layoff, right? So termination being someone is exited from the organization, right? So whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So I think sometimes people lump that under just termination, and then there's subsets. So layoff, performance, et cetera, right? So basic general distinction is termination is someone that there's been a break in a relationship, right? An employer-employee contractor relationship.
Yeah.
What I like to think about in terms of the distinction is I really think of one as more voluntary and one is more involuntary, in the sense, and I know that more people think voluntary, they think, well, I just left. I got up and I left an organization, right? So I either resigned, I made a distinction to actually leave the organization. What I'm really focused on when I think terminations, I think one is and it's going to be interesting, I voluntarily as an employee, so the way I look at it in terms of terminations versus layoffs, I voluntarily as an employee did or did not do something, broke a policy, did not adhere to a policy, right? So again, I'm putting it in the employee's control, right? I did something. I voluntarily did or did not do something that impacted my employment. So I was terminated from my role.
Mm-hmm.
A layoff is I was showing up to work. I was a wonderful employee. I involuntarily was removed and let go from this organization. So I do think there's very different distinctions. And as an HR professional for these many years, and when you say that I've been doing this for that long, it really ages me. But
I'm right there with you, though, my friend. Right there with you.
so when I, one of the things that the harder ones for me are those layoffs. Like I've had to do mass layoffs, and it's really difficult because the employees were doing nothing wrong. They were showing up to work, giving 110%. For me, it's a little easier to walk an employee through a performance termination because we've had several conversations. We've documented it. They knew the rules. They knew the policies, right? And so that's a distinction for me. And so for me personally, layoffs have always, it's honestly 2 days later after a layoff, like I take days off, like literally take days off after I do a layoff because it really emotionally impacts me.
Yeah. Well, let's touch on that because I think that's one thing that is really important. And there's a nuance there, right, to dealing with your emotions as a leader who is involved in the layoff process. I would say this Better.com CEO did not handle it well. How do what is the role of the leader's emotions in the layoff process?
That's a really, really good question. One of the things that I've always, when I'm coaching leaders, whether it's a layoff, termination, voluntary, where someone has done something wrong, one of the things I always do in terms of my coaching or advice for leaders around their emotion is I allow leaders to have that emotion. Right? I think it's really important to also understand that the leader is also an employee, right? We always get this confused. And so it's so interesting to me, right? I think we think, oh, they're leaders. Yeah, but they work for someone too. They might lead people, but in reality, they are an employee, right? It's not like they're something very different than an employee that also has an emotion. They've worked with these people. They've led these people. So I always let leaders have some time to walk through their own emotion, right? Because I believe this, your first reaction might not be your final reaction. Mm-hmm. As a leader, go through that first reaction. If you're mad, you're angry, you're sad, let's talk about it, because in the actual conversation with your employee, letting them know they're being laid off, the way in which you express that is going to be extremely important for that person, right? So I've seen leaders cry during the actual laying off employees.
Yeah,
that's not a good look.
Right? Yeah, so. I agree. I mean, I tell people, leaders when they're preparing, again, this is where the nuance is so important and the balance is so important. It's okay for people to see that this is hard for you, that this is not an easy thing. You don't want to appear to be a robot, right? Because that's a really common, I see people dealing with these kinds of emotions go one of two ways. The first is they get very, very emotional, right? Like crying, like you said. But the second then is, I'm going to try and protect myself, so I'm going to go robotic. And that's not a great response either. So, I tell people, I think it's okay for people to see that this is hard for you. Mm-hmm. You're a human. We're all humans here. But it's not about you either. Don't make it about you as the leader. This is about the person who is losing their job. Yes, it's very difficult to deliver that message to someone that they're losing their job. That is a hard thing to do. And yet, it is also, I would say, much harder to lose your job, to be the person who is actually losing their job. And so, let's keep it all in perspective, I think is really, really important.
Right. No, I definitely plus one that. That is definitely the way that I help leaders walk through. Because I do think there is a very fine balance, because I think the other thing that, again, things are so different than when I started in HR. We are such a litigious community. Like everybody will sue anybody just for any and everything. Like it's just, that's where we are. So I think there's this fear at times leaders have in terms of being robotic, where they're like, okay, well, I want to make sure I say exactly what I'm supposed to say. I'm not being tape recorded. I'm not going to get sued. I'm making sure I'm giving the same message, right? So there's this fear. And I think that unfortunately creates, like you said, that robotic feel. And so the person who's having this happen to them, they're like, wait a minute, I've ate lunch with you. I've been over your house. I know your children. And like, this is how this is going to happen to me. Right. Which interestingly enough, Rebecca, here's what happens 9 out of 10 times when I've seen that happen, very robotic. The manager will have that conversation. They'll walk out of the meeting. Lo and behold, the people or the person they just laid off will call them on their personal cell, and then they'll start talking real. That's when, like, right? That's when it normally goes like just left, right? And then so I agree. There's definitely this balance. And what I'd like to do for my leaders is, I think HR professionals should do this, is offer this ability to role play, like walk them through this. Sometimes this might be the first time, so it's not normal. So walk them through it, have some role play. Like, I'm really good at doing this. Like I'm that person who will can cry on contact, like cry in the moment. So I'll be that employee who breaks down and like cries, so that I give that leader that shock value. Like, okay, well, what do you do now? Right. Yeah. Make sure you come with a box of tissues. Make sure that you're there. Be that person to be able to, handle that. So I agree. You're dead on that there is a fine balance between the two.
Yeah, I think that's role playing is excellent advice. These are hard messages to deliver. They're even harder to receive. And people have a wide range of emotions in response to the message that they're losing their job to, right? And so I think people get really, really nervous about that. And, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? So some of the things that I recommend for leaders as they're going into that conversation too, is not to you want to get straight to the point, because by the time you're sitting down for this one-on-one, and by the way, let's just say for a moment, it should be a one-on-one conversation, not a 1 to 900 on Zoom. So let's just start there, right?
Exactly.
But this one-on-one conversation needs to be planned in, that someone is hearing directly from someone within the organization, ideally their boss, right? Or an HR person. Don't use euphemisms. If people are in shock, they don't understand it. It's like, we're letting you go, things like that. People don't always register that. So my best advice for people is, not to do small talk. You want to get to the point quickly. I'm sorry to tell you, your job is being eliminated, right? Something to that effect. You want to be, compassionate and yet direct. Mm-hmm. Being direct is kind, especially in this kind of situation.
Agreed. I completely agree with everything you're saying in terms of being direct and being kind. Right. I think there's those two things have to happen. It's about really being direct and being kind. So no, I fully agree that makes a lot of sense.
So, one of the other things I'm thinking about, like my major pet peeves for how companies handle layoffs, and I would love to hear yours as well. One of them that comes to mind is when companies announce layoffs, we're going to cut X% of our workforce. And then they say, we will notify you over the next week whether you still have a job. I've seen many, many companies do this, and we've worked with people directly who are in that situation. Number one, I think it's a cruel way to do it, because you now have put the entire company on notice and wondering and worrying about whether they're going to be part of it. Number two, you want a quick way to kill productivity for the entire
Mhm.
organization for that period of time plus
Exactly.
more,
Exactly.
that's the way to do it, right? So I think that is an absolutely terrible, terrible way to do it. What else comes to mind for you? What are some of the things that companies really screw up when they're doing or conducting layoffs?
It's interesting. I think we would, what you mentioned in terms of time, 'cause I think that's what it is. It's timing, right? It's a matter of
Mhm.
timing. I also have this, my pet peeve is having people work till the end of a day.
Yes.
And then, right, I have a problem with that. Like, you knew you were going to do this and you're going to have this conversation where you're laying someone off or you're laying a group of people off. Let's not do it that way, right? Let's not go ahead and say, okay, we're going to do it at the end of the day. I think that's just cruel, right? I think that's
Yeah.
just really, really cruel to do that in that fashion. I think obviously doing it over Zoom and doing it 1 to 900, doing a mass like that is extremely cruel. I think
Right.
I think having a conversation where your leader is not involved is cruel, right? So if I work for
Yeah.
you, Rebecca, and someone else is telling me, but again,
Yes.
I've given you 20 years. You and I
Yes.
know each other. That's cruel, right? So I think that's another one of
Totally.
those that I think is really, really cruel. I think the biggest thing, it's interesting. I think everything comes back to, and I liken this, I'm really, I've gotten older, one of the things I realized is that you should make things simpler, only because I guess I need it more simple because I'm older. So one of the things I've realized is that a couple of things. A The employer employee, that's a relationship, right? They call it
Mhm.
an employer employee relationship. So if we just use that basic term, when people are thinking of how they handle conversations, how would you handle a conversation with someone you are in a relationship? Right? I think it's
Yeah.
really key that, one of the key things they talk about a relationship is communication, right? Communicate. Tell me why. Tell me, right? Tell me often. Those are basics when you have an employer employee relationship. It's the same thing in layoffs, right? How would
Yep.
you handle ending a relationship? Right? What's the
Yeah.
best practice in ending a relationship? So I think, again, I try and keep these things really basic so that when I'm talking to or coaching leaders, I can say, let's look at the how this, it's a relationship. Start there, right?
Yep.
So I think that also is very important.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, honestly, I think we could talk about this all day.
We can.
Sure.
I'm ready. I
Right?
still have another 4 hours. Let's go.
I
I,
do I do want to end on this question of, for employees, if they suspect that layoffs are coming, if they've started to hear rumors around the organization, because it's almost always part of the equation as well, right? Rumors have started. What do we want employees to know if they suspect that layoffs are coming? Is there anything they can do to prepare?
yeah, I think there's a couple of things, and you and I've talked about these already. I think one of the biggest things, and we've talked about it in this conversation more specifically, is, and I would say, get your house in order, right? If you start
Yeah.
hearing that,
Yep.
medical, right? Make sure everyone is up to date on medical exams. Like, I've gone to my eye doctor, I've gotten all my checkups in, I've gotten my glasses, I've gotten my contacts, I've gotten my medication, right? Do
Yes.
that. Make sure your children have gotten their glasses, their booster shots, whatever it is that they need to have for school. Do
Yep.
all of those things right up front. Contact your financial advisor if you have one. Look at your 401k. What can you do there, right? Financially, think through, if I'm going to be laid off, I have a 401k. Can I tap into my 401k? What's that going to do? How long can I live? Like, all of those things are really, really vital, I think. So we talked about, like you said, first is finance, right? That impact,
Mhm.
and then medical, right? So I always think
Yep.
those two things right away, right? And then I think
Yep.
you'd probably list some, and you can kind of chime in. What are some of the other things from a more kind of immediate perspective other than those two? What else would you recommend?
Yeah. Some of the things that I recommend for people are really small and tactical, but these are things that can have a big impact on your life. And I've seen this go really poorly for people. So, for example, if you have a company issued phone, make sure that you have, if there are contacts in there that you want to keep, make sure that you are saving those in another location so that you'll have access to those after you leave. The one thing that I want people to keep in mind is if you are going to go through a layoff, you may lose access to everything. Very likely will lose access to everything, your logins, computer files, work products, any of those things. You will lose access to them very, very quickly. And so keeping that in mind, what are some things that you want to make sure you take with you? Examples of work that you've done, again, contacts, all of those sorts of are also really important to keep in mind and can have a big impact for people.
Agreed. I agree. Makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense.
Yeah. So we created a guide in the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of people were going through layoffs. We created a guide, an HRUprise guide for employees. It's the Employees Guide to Layoffs. So we'll include a link in the show notes to where people can download that because it also has, for example, 30 questions that you should ask if you actually are laid off, right? And it's all kinds of things just so that you get all the information that you need. So it's chock full of stuff. So we'll include a link to the show notes there as well.
Awesome.
Brian,
that'd be very helpful.
Yeah. So Brian, what do we want to leave with? What's your kind of final thought you want to leave people with when we're thinking about layoffs, the impact of layoffs, having to plan for them? What's your parting thought?
It's broader, and I appreciate this again. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the time. But one of the things I've really I've noticed, and I've said it already throughout this podcast, but I don't think it's something I can't say over and over again. I think leaders, companies, we need to think about how the world has changed in the past 2 years and how people are showing up differently. What people might have and you can see this by the Great Resignation and some of the other things that are occurring, people are prioritizing differently.
Yes.
And I really think leaders should take a look and be aware of the fact that what was important to someone 3 years ago is not necessarily as important today. And it requires you to have a level of compassion and understanding, sensitivity that, again, unfortunately, and I was one of these people when I first started in HR some many decades ago. You were that HR professional who said, hey, people need to come to work and leave their problems at home, right? They need to show up to work. Guess what happened? People are actually working in their homes. Where are they supposed to leave their issues?
Yeah,
right? You've got your kids running around. You've got all this happening, right? You see everything that's going. Where am I supposed to hide my concern? Where am I supposed to put that? Yeah. We have changed. We need to change. And I think that's what I would give employers. It's really companies, leaders, take that into account and really, really start to think about how you can think differently because the world is not what it was 2 years ago.
As said so well. I've started to think of the Great Resignation as really it's more the Great Reprioritization. It's not as catchy, but I think it's more accurate description of what's going on.
Very true.
Brian, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your knowledge and your insider perspective. And thank you so much for being a part of HRUprise. We are so honored to have you as a partner.
Awesome. I love it. Great work. Keep up the wonderful work you all do with HRUprise.
Problem Performers is a production of HRUprise Media. Part of an organization built around a single question. What if you could have HR that works for you rather than your boss? Well, now you can with your own HRUprise Coach. Get affordable, confidential advice from an experienced HR pro who works only for you. Learn more at HRUprise.com. And hey, employers, we've got you covered too. HRUprise provides independent investigations, harassment prevention training, private employee coaching, and much more. Email us at hello@HRUprise.com or visit our page at HRUprise.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.